When working with a buyer or a prospective tenant, you are required to have an exclusive brokerage agreement with your client. This is what allows you to represent them in a fiduciary capacity and also lays out the responsibilities to protect both parties and make sure that you are paid at the end of the day. So just to go through this document, you're going to have the buyer information filled out at the top. I'm using Barry Buyer as my example. And then for your broker information, make sure you put down Keller Williams Legacy. There's the address, and make sure the office telephone is on there, as well as your own personal information. Section 3 is just indicating what type of property you may be looking at. Honestly, I usually just put residential property, or if they were just looking for rentals, you can use a little bit of discretion there based on what your buyer actually needs. Now getting to the meat of the agreement. It is required in the state of Maryland that there be a set term for your agency agreement. And also there's a brand new law as of 2024 or late 2023 that indicates the buyer agency term may not be longer than a year in duration. And that's even with continuances or extensions. Okay, so you can use a lot of discretion here in how long you want your agreement to be, but it cannot be longer than 1 year under any situation. So a lot of people will put a 1-year term just to sort of make it so that even if it takes a little bit longer, you don't need to constantly be redoing these agreements. So 1 year is certainly customary, but just make sure you have the conversation. Just because you put a year here, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to take a year. Some people will put down a shorter duration here, maybe 90 days, 6 months, just to make it clear that, hey, we're going to be aggressive here. This hopefully won't take too long, but always make sure you have that understanding that if it does take longer, you would then need to get an extension in place. It's also required in the state of Maryland that there be rights for either party to terminate. So I like to have it so that either party can terminate in writing, and then you need to put some days notice. So some people will put terminable immediately upon written notice of either party. I like to include a little bit of a buffer, whether it's 3, 5, 7 days, just so that if somebody sends an emotional email, you have a little bit of time to maybe work through any issues, any miscommunications, and maybe sort of save the relationship. So I like to build in a little bit of time here, but you also don't want to put 30 days or 90 days to sort of put a gun to somebody's head and force them to work with you if they don't want to. So just make sure it's terminable in writing, and put some duration of days there. And I also build in so that the unilateral right to terminate doesn't trigger if you're already under contract. Obviously, you can agree in writing to part ways, but once you're under contract, you're basically stuck together for better or for worse. Make sure you go through these fair housing, make sure that they understand the coming soon status and what our responsibilities are. Section 8 is obviously very important. This is how you get paid. And this is even more important now that we have this conversation in light of recent litigation that's going all around the real estate industry. So it's imperative here that you have a conversation about your value and you state exactly what you expect to be paid, right? So for a very long time, it was customary for people to just write per MLS saying, sure, actually it's going to be no cost to you, Mr. Buyer. Whatever the seller agrees to compensate me with, that's just what I'll take. That language has been specifically targeted by attorneys to say this is actually a nonsensical and irrational way to run a business. The only reason you would get away with doing this is if there was some conspiracy to fix commissions and force the seller to pay more than they should. So this is very, very bad language. You cannot put per MLS. So instead, what you need to do is just state what you need to be paid. If that's 2%, if that's 3%, whatever you're comfortable putting here is what you expect to be paid. Okay, now there's basically three options. You can put a percent, you can put a percent plus some flat fee, or if you simply wanted to make it easy, say, I'm going to make $7,000 for my services, you could just put one larger flat fee for your entire compensation. So you get to generate your business however is appropriate for you. But I will say most of the agreements that I see will have between 2.5% and 3% here, plus or minus a flat fee if you are comfortable charging that and can make sure that you justify that to your client. The next paragraph is a little bit confusing, so I always spend a little bit of time when discussing it with prospective buyers or tenants. This is basically a provision that protects you, the agent, from the buyer or tenant sort of acting in bad faith, firing you at the last second to try to save a few bucks, right? So this basically says, if you help them find a house, if you show them a house, if you send them a house, they can't just fire you and then go under contract with that house and try to negotiate down the price. So in this instance, I put 90 days. So let's say they fire you, but within 90 days, they then go under contract in a house that you showed them, you would still get paid in that instance. So I've seen 180 days here, I've seen 90, I've seen 30, 60. Put a decent number here and just have the conversation at the outset. Hey, we're all on the same team here. And oh, by the way, if you had in the back of the mind that maybe you'd just fire me at the last second, you actually don't save money that way. So let's actually just work together. Finally, in the event that the buyer goes ahead and rents a property instead of purchasing a property, then you'd set out what your compensation is in that event. So I've put here 1/2 of 1 month's rent. That is probably what I would say is the most customary compensation for helping a prospective tenant. I certainly have seen and have no problem with people putting 1 full month's rent. It's a lot of work to deal with renters, so you can build your business however you like. Now, the important dynamic here is that it's very possible, and in most cases is the case, that the seller is going to offer some compensation for you, the buyer agent. So if on the MLS, under the listing terms, it says cooperative compensation is 2.5%, or maybe it's 2%, or maybe it's $5, they can offer whatever they want. And what this says is that you, the buyer, can go ahead and you, the buyer agent, can go ahead and receive that compensation from the seller, and that would offset whatever obligation you put in Section 8A. So if you were asking for 2.5% and the seller pays 2.5%, that's perfect, that's easy. The buyer doesn't actually have to come out of pocket for any amount. But let's say you put 3% plus a $4.95 transaction fee, and the seller was only offering 2%, your buyer then needs to understand that they would come out of pocket for an extra percent plus this flat fee. So you put whatever number you feel is sort of your minimum compensation that you shall receive in Section A, and then Section B protects you, indicating that if the seller offers something, that can offset what you put in Section A. And in fact, let's say you put a smaller number in Section A, like 2%, but the fee the seller was offering was 3%, you would still be able to take that full 3%, if that makes sense. So what you put in Section 8A is really a minimum required compensation that in the event a seller is not offering any cooperative compensation, the buyer needs to understand they would come out of pocket for that amount. Okay, so this is a lot of information. Make sure you understand Section 8. This is really important that we communicate our value clearly, that we answer any questions, and that we're proactive about any concerns that our clients might have. Make sure you also go through these sections 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. These are customary. This is an MAR drafted form. This isn't really something that's negotiable, but it lays out your rights, your responsibilities, so that they are on notice for how the transaction takes place. And then finally, you're going to go ahead and check any addenda that you know you're going to attach or are attaching. So I always like to attach the consent for dual agency. I would like the buyer to feel open to the idea of looking at another Keller Williams Legacy listing. It wouldn't make sense for the buyer to just throw out any listing that was offered by Keller Williams Legacy, right? So that's something that I like to get them to consent to in advance. If it is your own property or you have a legal interest in the entity that is purchasing a property, you would click there. And if you were on a team, then similarly, you would click here and provide this addendum just to open up the possibility that this buyer could still buy from someone else on your team. You would sign as the authorized representative, you the buyer agent, have the buyer sign, and there you have a finalized buyer-broker agreement.